It's hard to imagine Christmas without the sparkle of electric lights, the smell of pine trees in the living room, or children unwrapping gifts under a tall evergreen. But in Hampton Roads, during the years of the American Revolution, Christmas looked and sounded very different. Today, we take you back to that world, to the long-ago Christmases of Colonial Virginia, and to a Hampton Roads that celebrated under the shadow of revolution. Christmas in Colonial Virginia was very different from what we know today, as Kathleen Hellyer, senior historian at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, explains.
It was actually very different in 18th century Virginia because Christmas begins with Christmas, and then there are 12 days of Christmas. So Christmas ends with Epiphany, which is January 6th, the celebration of the arrival of the Magi. So the celebration kind of begins with Christmas and continues afterwards.
Rather than building up to December 25th, Virginians treated that date as the starting point. What followed was the Christmastide, a nearly 2-week season of gatherings, church services, visiting neighbors, and celebrations that stretched through Twelfth Night. And it was that final night, marking the arrival of Epiphany on January 6th, that often hosted the grandest festivities of the season, an evening of dancing, feasting, music, and late-night merriment. Washington himself chose Twelfth Night to marry Martha, as Kathleen Hellyer says.
George and Martha Washington, for example, got married on January 6th. They got married on Epiphany. Thomas Jefferson and his wife were married on New Year's Day. It was a good time for a couple of reasons, right? During the agricultural year, this is a slow time. And because it's Christmas, people are already gathering together. So it was a good time to have weddings and celebrate unions of people coming together.
We can't say for certain what melodies filled the room at these weddings, but we do know that Washington himself adored a tune that echoed through countless holiday gatherings of the time, the Derby Ram.
As I was going to Derby on a market day, I spied the biggest ram, sir, that ever was fed on hay, and sing lay-lum, pitiful lay-lum, lay, and sing lay-lum, pitiful lay-lum, lay.
Philip Vickers Fithian, a young tutor from New Jersey spending his first Virginia Christmas at Nominee Hall in 1773, captured the spirit of the season in his journal.
Nothing is now to be heard of in conversation but the balls, the fox hunts, the fine entertainments, and the good fellowship which are to be exhibited at the approaching Christmas. I almost think myself happy that my horse's lameness will be sufficient excuse for my keeping at home these holidays.
The Virginia Almanac for 1772 also reflected this seasonal spirit.
This month, much meat will be roasted in rich men's kitchens, the cooks sweating in the making of minced pies and other Christmas cheer, and whole rivers of punch, toddy, wine, beer, and cider consumed with drinking. Cards and dice will be greatly used to drive away the tedious of the long and cold nights, and much money will be lost on whist, cribbage, and all fours.
Schools, including the College of William and Mary, closed for the entire festive season, a break the children eagerly guarded, according to Kathleen Hellyer.
The children would prevent their teacher or tutor from entering into the schoolroom on whatever day that they thought should begin their holiday. Philip Fithian, the tutor that we talked about, said that a neighboring tutor had been barred out on December 13th, and the holiday was to be extended, until 12th day. So the children had quite a bit of time off.
But while they had a break from classes, Christmas was not yet a holiday made for them. It was a season for adults, a time to socialize, exchange visits, and host lavish entertainments. On the grand plantations across Tidewater, the wealthy spared no expense. One family even hired fiddlers, a jester, a tightrope walker, and an acrobat to amuse their guests. Children, meanwhile, stayed on the sidelines, watching from the corner until they were old enough to join in, as Kathleen Hellyer explains.
Sometimes someone in the neighborhood would host a ball, so there would be music and dancing and food. Dancing was very popular in entertainment in Virginia, and they made sure to teach their children how to dance and how to appear in public. So usually young children didn't attend those balls until they had had some dancing lessons in their early teens, where they, were getting to be old enough to partake in those entertainments.
And what about presents? Well, yes, children received gifts, but not the kind we think of today. There were no stockings by the chimney, no piles of toys waiting under a tree on Christmas Day.
New Year's Day was actually more of the day for children to receive gifts, as opposed to Christmas. But they were small. Books were especially common, small amounts of sweets, gloves, gifts for children, and servants and apprentices and things.
And occasionally, they were allowed to stay awake until late in the night and sing carols. These simple tunes were just starting to catch on again among the colonists, adding a touch of joy to long winter nights.
God rest you, merry gentlemen, let nothing you dismay. For Jesus Christ our Savior was born upon this day, to save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. Oh, tidings of comfort and joy, and joy.
Household servants could also expect some kind of gifts or tips in recognition of their service. Philip Vickers-Fithian, the tutor from New Jersey, recorded giving a little more than 3 shillings to the servants for what they called a Christmas box.
Christmas boxes were usually sometime during this Christmas celebration, and it wasn't an actual physical box, although in England at least, and maybe here, they had sort of pottery, almost like, they weren't shaped like pigs, but they were kind of like that. They were made of pottery. They had a slot in them. So people would give small gifts of money to apprentices and servants and enslaved people and children. So when they had collected all they had to collect, then they could break the box open, and then they would have a little bit of money to spend how they wished.
Likewise, Thomas Jefferson notes in his 1779 account book that he spent 48 shillings on Christmas presents, enough to buy a few books, some sweets, or a small handmade toy like a wooden horse or a doll. The imagery was also different. No Christmas tree in the parlor. That German tradition wouldn't appear here until the 19th century. In fact, the very first documented tree in Virginia appeared in Williamsburg in December 1842. Charles Minnigerode, a German tutor living with the Tucker family at the St. George Tucker House, introduced the children to this German custom by bringing a small evergreen indoors. He carefully attached candles with bits of wire and then lit them, showing the young Tuckers how Christmas was celebrated in his homeland.
Even though they didn't have a tree, everything else that we think about with Christmas was still associated. So you still had the greenery, the garland, the wreath, and that sort of thing. They still had plenty of that. And they used greenery that they could find that was local around them. So, for example, holly, ivy, and mistletoe would have been something that they would have had. And the thing is, mistletoe in Europe and mistletoe in America are both native, so they would have had those as well. In America, they also used things that were local around them, like pine, cedar, and even magnolia leaves, things that were green. That was the whole point. They needed to be green and look alive and fresh.
Michael Grease is a guide at Berkeley Plantation in Charles City, Virginia, where they recreate the colonial Christmas decorations, including the mistletoe.
The kissing tradition was done again with mistletoe because mistletoe was considered to be a plant of peace. And what they would do is, colonial and Victorian times, they would hang the mistletoe in a doorway or a place that would have a lot of traffic. So that would go back and forth and such. And it was actually bad luck to refuse a young woman if she was standing under the mistletoe. Now, with that being said, after a kiss was received, then they would pluck a berry from the mistletoe. And when there were no more berries, there was no more kisses.
The Yule log played an equally important role, according to Michael Grease. The largest log available would be brought inside and burned throughout the Christmas season, for the celebration lasted as long as the fire did. Sometimes the long trunk would stick out into the room, burning slowly over several days, a warm and glowing centerpiece for family gatherings.
In colonial times, they would use logs that were mainly dry, but still had a little bit of green left in them, so they would burn slower and longer. And after the 12th day, they would take the ashes or any remains and they would store it, and then they would use that to rekindle the next year's Yule log. And it was said to bring good luck for the year.
While fires roared in the hearth, a soft glow from the candles filled the rooms. Some of them were placed in the windows, a quiet sign of welcome to travelers, as Michael Grease explains.
If there was a lit candle in the window, it was a sign of hospitality and welcoming. What it meant was that a place with a candle in the window, they were able to receive people, passersby, that needed to be fed and warm. So it was like a stopping place or a place for them to kind of rest and have a little bit of respite before they continued on.
This tradition was revived in Williamsburg in 1930 with the Grand Illumination, originally called the White Lightning, when every window along Gloucester Duke Street was lit. Today, this tradition endures, and many homes in Hampton Roads still light their windows during the holidays, continuing a centuries-old custom of welcoming friends and family.
While shepherds watch their flocks by night, O seated on the ground.
Another colonial popular tradition was wassailing. Michael Grease from the Berkeley Plantation describes it.
Wassailing, basically, people would gather together in colonial times and they would go around and they would wassail. Wassail literally means to be in good health. It was a greeting that people would give. And now, a lot of times it was people, it wasn't rich who were going, it was people who were more disadvantaged, and they would go door to door and they would get a little bit of food. So it was something that to be shared, and it was expected to share this drink or wassail.
The wassail bowl was a large communal pot of hot cider or ale, sweetened and scented with nutmeg, ginger, cloves, and sometimes whipped egg white foam.
But one of the main ingredients for wassail is it has to be apple-based. So it has to be, in some cases you might see them using actual apples and mashing them up. But a lot of times you see a lot of apple cider. That would have been something that they would have used. And then with that apple cider, that would have been the base. And you would have actually went and added more things like citrus, orange, or lemon, and a little bit of sweetness that would have gone through it. And wassail could either be alcoholic, which people expected at that time, or non-alcoholic is something that we do today. And it would have been a warm drink. It would have been something to warm you up.
The guests would raise a toast of wassail and pass the cup around, singing and wishing one another well. Actually, the origin of the word toast comes from the wassail, as Michael Grease explains.
When people went wassailing, they would have had something warm to drink. And a lot of times they didn't actually be able to have a cup. They would take toast and they would dip it in. And that would have been how they would have got that. And placing toast or bread in floated wassail bowl, which is where we get our tradition of the toast, when you have a toast at it.
Over time, this kind of drink would evolve into what we now know as eggnog, a creamy festive beverage that still warms the holidays, much like today's pumpkin spice lattes and mulled ciders. The Christmas table in Hampton Roads drew from both Old World recipes and the bounty of the Tidewater fields.
We need to remember that during colonial times, especially, that people in Virginia still considered themselves to be English, so they really did try to keep those English traditions alive. So one of those traditions would have been, for example, roast beef. Having a roast beef on the table would have been one of those traditions that they would have tried to continue, but they also would have used something local. So they would have used things around them that they could easily get. Now, of course, being in Virginia, Virginia ham was not unknown, and of course they would have had something of that effect as well. They would have also used things that were around them. Remember, a lot of these plantations were out in the middle of nowhere, so they were out in the middle of the woods. So they would have had wildfowl and game. They would have had turkey, goose, duck, even venison. And a lot of these grand homes are on rivers, so they would have used what was available there. Oysters and crabs and various fish like rockfish and even sturgeon were common for them to use.
Vegetables and herbs from home gardens added color and flavor, while seasonal fruits like apples, pears, and preserved citrus brought sweetness to the table. Every dish required time and labor. Nothing came ready-made, and convenience was a world away from our modern supermarkets.
Things that we take for granted today, things that are extremely easy for us to make, like gelatin, for example, they would have had a gelatin on display, and it would have been a crowning piece because of all the labor that went into fixing something like that.
For dessert, rich plum puddings, mince pies, and fruit cakes richly filled with dried fruit and spices. Dishes that reflect English traditions, adapted to local ingredients.
One of the things that we think of when you think of colonial tradition is puddings and fruit cakes and things like that. And it would have been very common for them to have these things, even minced meat pies. Now, that to us sounds a little bit different. If we look at a recipe today in the 21st century for minced meat, it has no meat in it. But in colonial times, there would have been meat in a mincemeat pie. It was a way for them to preserve the meat. They would have used spices and things like that they would have used to preserve the meat and be able to stretch it through the winter.
The celebration also included festive drinks, most of them with alcohol, like the syllabub, a lightly whipped blend of cream, sugar, wine or cider, and lemon zest. It was often served in tall glass goblets and topped with a sprinkle of nutmeg, a luxurious drink usually reserved for households that could afford such indulgence. Not everyone could afford the lavish entertainments of the wealthy, but that didn't mean Christmas went uncelebrated. For Virginia's middling sort, artisans, tavern keepers, journeymen, small farm families, the season was also a time for gathering, music, and dance. They didn't meet in grand parlors, but in smaller houses where the atmosphere was warm, lively, and communal. Instead of elegant European minuets, Virginians favored country dances, jigs, and reels, the prevailing social style of the time. According to the Encyclopedia of Virginia, these dances were performed in long lines, with partners facing one another in a long ways set. Guided by manuals like John Playford's The English Dancing Master, dancers of all skill levels could participate, moving up and down the lines and dancing with every couple in turn. Food and drink reflected what was at hand: warm cider or spiced punch in a communal bowl, simple cakes, preserved fruits, and other modest treats. While these gatherings lacked the roasted turkeys and elaborate desserts of the elite's events, the celebrations were rich in fellowship and joy. Taverns or neighborly homes offered a cozy setting where work and social obligations could be set aside, if only for a night. And while the fiddles and jigs of the tavern brought joy and energy, music in colonial Virginia also had a solemn side. The Anglican Church, central to many communities, provided a more structured musical experience. Congregations gathered to sing psalms and hymns guided by the Book of Common Prayer. These songs, often accompanied by organs or small instrumental ensembles, offered both worship and instruction, a way to mark the sacred days with devotion. For dissenting groups, Baptists, Presbyterians, Quakers, who made up roughly 20 to 30% of Virginia's population at that time, especially in the western region, Christmas was observed much more quietly or not at all. Baptists gathered for prayer and simple hymns in small homes, avoiding feasts or formal ceremonies. Presbyterians could hold modest worship services with readings and sermons on the Nativity, but still remaining sober and reflective. Quakers and some Puritans were similarly restrained. Some attended religious services, while others simply went about their day, treating Christmas like any other. Many early Puritans in New England had once considered Christmas unbiblical, even criminalizing its celebration in 1659, though by the late 18th century the holiday was widely observed.
Freedom, oh, freedom, children, freedom over me, hallelujah, and before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be saved.
And for enslaved people, well, it was complicated. We have few records of how enslaved people actually spent the holiday. One Presbyterian minister, however, described a group in Virginia singing psalms and hymns in the evening and again before dawn on Christmas morning, keeping their own traditions alive under difficult circumstances. Some enslavers gave extra rations or a bit of time off, hoping their workers could enjoy a rare day of rest. But for many, the holiday meant more work, attending to guests, cooking, or even playing music to entertain, as Kathleen Hellyer points out.
They were generally given a few days off during the Christmas holidays, but it had to be worked in around whatever the schedule was for their enslavers' families. So if they were going to host a special dinner or a ball, the cook and the kitchen workers and the waiting men would have to be on hand to work. And if they were going to visit neighbors for dinner or a dance, the coachman and the waiting man and the postilion would have to work at that time. But even so, it was understood that they would be given 2 or 3 days off during the Christmas holidays.
Some enslaved people used those few days of freedom to visit their families, traveling long distances to see loved ones from whom they had been separated, whether by sale, relocation, or the common practice of being hired out.
During the time off, many enslaved people who'd been separated from their families would travel to see them, often pretty long distances. So that was a happy time for reunited families when, members who had been separated saw one another. And they might also have been separated by the practice of hiring out. So you might hire one of your enslaved people to someone else, a neighbor or perhaps someone farther away, to be able to reap a profit from their labor. And that year, they were hired by the year, typically beginning on January 1st. So it was a happy time of reunion when that person came home for their family, because they'd been separated for the best part of the year. But it was also a time of anxiety, because if you thought that members of the household, or members of the enslaved community would be hired out for the following year, it was a time of anxiety, because hiring day, as we said, was genuinely January 1st.
When you combine the anxiety of possible separation with the rare chance of having time off and moving about with less supervision, the conditions were ripe for some to consider running away, and enslavers knew it. A 1770 article in the Virginia Gazette, for instance, describes a rebellion at a Hanover County plantation and reports that colonial authorities even authorized special Christmas patrols to maintain control. Meanwhile, the indigenous people of the region, mainly the Powhatan and other Algonquin-speaking communities, followed their own winter rhythms. Fields were empty, and they relied on hunting deer, fishing, gathering shellfish, and storing roots and nuts. Villages came together to fix canoes and tools, share stories, and hold dances and ceremonies to give thanks for survival and the return of spring. Though different from European holidays, the season had its own meaning, full of community, resilience, and gratitude. Then came 1774, a year of political tension that would soon explode into revolution. In August, the First Virginia Convention, called after the royal governor dissolved the Colonial Assembly, proposed an embargo on British goods. By October, the colonies agreed to boycott British imports starting December 1st. That changed the holiday table. Locally produced substitutes filled the gaps: cider and rum instead of imported wines, honey or molasses instead of refined sugar, and instead of British tea, Liberty tea became popular, made from local herbs such as sassafras, raspberry, or currant. But that wasn't the only measure that the Virginia Convention adopted, as Jim Gallagher, volunteer at the American Revolution Museum, expounds.
The first Virginia Convention proposed and adopted an embargo on the importation and purchase of British goods. And at the same time that they did that, they called for measures of austerity. They didn't want people engaging in frivolity when the country was, so seriously opposed to Parliament and what they considered intolerable laws that had been passed against the colonies. And so they also banned things like horse racing and gambling and playing cards. They were supposed to abstain from throwing parties. And because of that, Christmas of 1774 was really the first Christmas of austerity in Virginia.
In this new atmosphere, even consumption became political. Wearing homespun clothing or serving only local beverages wasn't just practical, it was a statement of loyalty to the patriot cause, reinforced by local committees who closely watched their neighbors' choices. And that tension only deepened. By mid-1775, the call to arms. The Third Virginia Convention met, authorized 2 provincial regiments, and ordered the colony to be divided into 16 military districts, including one that covered the Tidewater region of Princess Anne, Norfolk, and Isle of Wight. The colony was getting ready for the war. At first, some men volunteered, driven by patriotism or curiosity, but soon the law made it clear. Service was expected, not optional, for men between the ages of 16 and 50. Across Tidewater, fathers, husbands, and older sons left their homes, fields, and businesses behind. Families watched them go with heavy hearts. Small towns and plantations emptied of the able-bodied men, leaving women to manage households, care for children, tend livestock, and keep the farm running. By late 1775, the war had reached Hampton Roads in a very real way. Royal Governor Lord Dunmore, forced from Williamsburg, declared martial law from Norfolk and offered freedom to any enslaved person who would join the British side. Hundreds fled plantations in Tidewater, forming what became known as the Ethiopian Regiment. Everyone was picking a side, and they were about to enter into action. December 1775, Great Bridge. The Patriots side, led by William Woodford, numbered roughly 900 men, including regulars, newly formed Minutemen, and county militias. On the British side, there were probably around 700 men, including the 14th Regiment of Foot, the Queen's Own local Virginia Regiment, volunteer loyalists, and the Ethiopian Regiment. Both camps were set on either side of the causeway. The men were ready for the standoff, though the conditions were far from comfortable, as Jim Gallagher describes.
At Great Bridge, the conditions were really pretty bad. The ground was very muddy. There was a shortage of tents and blankets and shoes. The weather was wet, the ground's muddy. They're sleeping on the ground, pretty much on top of any straw that they might have been able to find, or they may have gone out and cut pine branches and laid them on the ground inside their tents, and they're sleeping on top of that. If your shoes got rotten, you had no replacement for your shoes. Many men did not have a blanket, so they were sharing blankets. Their day was kind of tough. They begin their day at about 5 o'clock in the morning. They'd have to rise for reveille. They would strike their tents so that the ground underneath their tents could air out and that the tents themselves could dry out every day. They would have to clean the streets of any filth or refuse that was in their streets. They had an order that they were to present themselves, quote, as decent and clean as the nature of our service would allow, but the facilities were not very conducive to shaving and bathing. So they were taking it, at best, they were taking sort of wet cloth baths just to get the grime off. So the conditions themselves were pretty harsh.
But even so, when December 9th dawned, they were ready. The Battle of Great Bridge lasted barely half an hour. Patriots suffered essentially no fatalities, just one man wounded. In contrast, the British and Loyalist side lost over 100 men killed or wounded. After such a decisive victory, the men who had been in the field for weeks were exhausted. They longed for rest and for home. Jim Gallagher explains what happened next.
You have people who have been in the field who are aching to go home. About a week after the Battle of Great Bridge, General William Woodford, who was the commander of the force at Great Bridge, gets superseded by a higher-ranking colonel, Robert House, who comes up from North Carolina, and is, because his commission comes from Continental Congress, whereas Woodford's comes from Virginia, technically Howe outranks him. So Howe takes over the Virginia forces and North Carolina forces that are surrounding Norfolk. And William Woodford now sees the opportunity that, having been in the field for so long, he has the opportunity to go home and spend the holiday season with his family. And he asks permission from the Virginia Committee of Safety to go home and spend the Christmas season with his family. We have his letter making that request. And of course, it doesn't happen because Norfolk heats up so quickly and so broadly that Woodford is never able to go home and spend Christmas with his family.
And Woodford wasn't the only one. Across the encampments, men hoped the lull after Great Bridge might grant them a brief return to their families for Christmas. But Norfolk would not remain quiet for long. For the next 2 weeks, tension settled over Tidewater like a heavy fog. That Christmas was not one to celebrate, but to fear. Then the warning. The British governor ordered civilians to evacuate the city of Norfolk. By New Year's Eve, many of the residents had fled. And then, as winter gave way to January 1776, the British fleet opened fire. That night, while much of the world was celebrating the New Year, British ships opened fire on Norfolk from the Elizabeth River. The bombardment lasted hours, but the city burned for days, as Patriot forces set fire to one building after another to prevent the British from occupying them. The sky turned a luminous ruby color, visible from miles around. A Patriot officer stationed in Hampton, more than a dozen miles to the northwest, wrote to his wife that the clouds appeared as red and bright as they can do in an evening at sunsetting. Women and children still in town were forced to flee, as this extract from the Virginia Gazette recounts.
It was a shocking scene to see the poor women and children running about through the fire and exposed to the guns from the ships, some of them with children at their breasts.
As the first day of 1776 ended, the thriving port city, home to nearly 6,500 people, was a roaring inferno. Within 3 days, most of Norfolk was a smoking ruin, and within 5 weeks, not a single building was left standing. No American city before or since has suffered such complete destruction. After the war, life in Tidewater slowly stitched itself back together. By the mid-1780s, churches were full again for Christmas services, merchants were restocking tables, and neighbors began to gather for music and dance once more. Old customs, like the candles in the windows, the communal wassail, or the country dances, reappeared as towns recovered and trade revived. Some of these practices would later be celebrated and even reimagined by generations to come. But the basic rhythms of a Virginia Christmas, church, fellowship, and green boughs at the door, were never lost for long. When the British blockade finally lifted in 1783, the people of Hampton Roads began to rebuild not only their city, but their lives. Families returned to Norfolk, raising new homes from the ruins and restoring the hum of ordinary days. A new courthouse was built on Main Street in 1790. The Myers House in 1792. Brick by brick, the borough took shape again, reaching a population of approximately 3,000 people in 1790. Christmas, too, came quietly back. It wasn't proclaimed, but reborn in the small, steadfast rituals of everyday life. Though the imported luxuries were slower to return, the green of holly and the bustle of carriages showed up again. Tavern halls echoed with lively country dances, friends toasted with cider poured from local barrels, and hymns and carols returned to the homes and churches. Centuries later, we continue to celebrate much in the same way. Fruit and greenery wreaths still adorn our doors, candles still shine in our windows, familiar hymns and carols fill the air, and slices of old-fashioned fruitcake appear on holiday tables. In this way, the spirit of colonial Christmas lives on. Joy, tradition, and community can persist even through hardship, a thread linking past and present across the centuries.
Christmas in Colonial Virginia was a production of WHRO Public Media in Norfolk. To learn more about this and other events of America's Revolutionary Era, visit whro.org/USA250.